Hi guys, this week's video is another one of your requests, and in this one I'm going to be talking about fears and phobias, what causes them, why we struggle to change, and what we need to do to ultimately overcome them. I'm Tim Box, Mind Coach, and this is everything you need to know about phobias and how to get rid of fear. So welcome back to my channel, or if this is your first time, I'm Tim Box, I'm a mind coach, and for the last 12 years or so I've been working with people to help them overcome all sorts of emotional and psychological issues, and in particular helping people get control of anxiety. If you'd like to support my efforts to help, then please leave a like on this video, and why not subscribe for mind coaching and anxiety advice videos every week. So, when I started my career as a hypnotherapist, I had the understandable idea that I'd be seeing a lot of people to help them get rid of their fears and phobias. It was one of the main areas I'd trained in, so I hit that area quite hard with my marketing. Then of course, as the hordes of people flocked to stay at home, I realised that when people have fears, they mostly don't go and seek help for it. There's two main reasons for this. Firstly, going to see a therapist about the thing we fear is the first step towards coming face to face with it. This tends to make people just as scared of coming to see people like me as they are of the thing they have the fear of. The second reason is that people tend to put much more energy into avoiding the things they're afraid of than they do into taking steps to get comfortable with them. A few years ago, the London Underground produced a map of all the tube lines that showed when the train goes underground and when it's overground. This was so that those who suffered with claustrophobia or anxiety about confined spaces were able to navigate their way round the London Underground system whilst minimising exposure to any uncomfortable situations. And this is the sort of thing we all do every day. Instead of engaging in the necessary process to overcome our fears, we simply draw up a map in our subconscious that shows how to go about our business whilst managing to avoid the things we're afraid of. If someone comes to see me to help with a phobia, you can bet they're here because for some reason they can no longer avoid that particular situation. So I saw a lady for a fear of flying whose sister had just booked her wedding in Barbados and was flying the entire family out there to attend. Her life had been hugely restricted by an inability to go on a plane, but it was only now that she had to do this for the family that she came to get it sorted. I saw a man for a fear of spiders who had happily navigated his way through life for 40 years, only occasionally coming face to face with a spider, but had recently moved out to the country and now couldn't seem to avoid them anymore. Finally had to do something about it. Perhaps the one that sticks in my mind most is the lady who had a fear of needles and had simply steered clear of hospitals for her entire life until she developed a life-threatening condition that meant she had to have an operation. It was only then that she reached out for help. So if you're watching this video because you want to find out how to get rid of the fears that hold you back, then good for you. You're in the vast majority in terms of having a fear, but you're in the huge minority in deciding to do something about it. So, many therapists like to draw a clear line between a fear and a phobia. They're often regarded as a different level or even a different category of response. And you'll hear this opinion a lot. On more than a few occasions, I've seen people on reality shows where they have to perform challenges make a claim that their fear is more valid because they have a genuine phobia as opposed to a normal everyday fear.
I'm claustrophobic, Darren!
However, the way these two get defined and distinguished between can vary drastically. Some will say a fear is the valuable response that keeps us safe from danger, whereas a phobia is when the fear becomes disproportionate and inappropriately high for the given situation. Some will say that a phobia is defined as the point where a fear starts to take over our life and our response becomes debilitating. A common definition of a phobia is when fear reaches the point of being irrational. And to be fair, I hear a lot of people in session tell me that they want to get rid of their fear because it's now irrational. But in reality, of course, it never is. After all, irrational means without reason. And in truth, there's always a reason why we fear something. Now, it might not always be a logical reason or a reason we can defend, but there's a reason nonetheless. A lot of the time, understanding that reason can be the first step towards removing the response, but more about that later. I don't tend to distinguish between the terms fear and phobia. Any reason for distinction tends to be pretty arbitrary and fairly redundant when it comes to changing the way we feel. If we categorize a phobia as something more serious or valid than a fear, then we just create a potential barrier to making a change. What's more important than deciding what we call our fear is understanding why we still have that fear, and that can sometimes involve being aware of its origins. Whilst there is some research to suggest we can have some genetic predispositions to developing specific fears, the one thing we know is that fear is primarily a learnt response designed to keep us safe from danger. If a part of our mind perceives a situation as dangerous, it will trigger the fear response. We become uncomfortable in a way that is impossible to ignore, and we move away from the perceived danger to once again feel comfortable. So we might feel our heart quicken and our muscles tense as our body gets ready to take action to avoid the imminent threat. Whilst this is a valuable and potentially life-saving response, we'll sometimes find ourselves feeling afraid of something that we realise actually poses us no threat. The classic example of this would be a fear of spiders. Many people are afraid of them, even though they pose us no threat. Unless of course you live in Australia, where it's best to just avoid all living things, because everything there seems to have at least some potential to kill you. But anyway, here's an example of how we might develop a fear of spiders. Let's say we're 4 or 5 years old and a spider runs out in the kitchen. Mum screams and jumps on a chair, and our learning mind concludes that this must be the appropriate response to these little things because Mum is who we're learning from, and she seems to be suggesting they are to be feared. This knowledge about the dangers of spiders goes into our mind and onto the list of things to avoid. Every spider we see for the rest of our life triggers a fear response, even though as we grow, we very quickly realise that these tiny things can't actually hurt us, at least not in any way that requires us to trigger fight or flight. So why do we continue to be afraid if we now know spiders aren't dangerous? Whilst being afraid of something we know isn't scary might at first seem like something about our thinking is going wrong, there's actually a simple explanation for why we get stuck with old beliefs and responses even in the face of new information. There's a part of our mind that often gets referred to as the critical faculty. This is the part that protects our idea of what reality is. It stops our subconscious beliefs getting arbitrarily updated with every random piece of information we hear, no matter how inaccurate or unbelievable. When new information comes in, our critical faculty will judge it for truth. Anything new that doesn't match up with, or isn't at least compatible with, our existing version of reality will be rejected as false, no matter how much sense it makes logically. This is why we can sometimes struggle to update responses and beliefs that are no longer appropriate, because there's a part of our mind protecting that truth. So the critical faculty works a little bit like a security guard or a bouncer at the door of a nightclub, rejecting potential beliefs that look like they're going to disagree with the beliefs that are already in there. When it comes to updating our responses, it's all about getting information past that security guard and installing a new truth. So how do we do that then? So as many of you will know, I work in the field of hypnotherapy, and when us hypnotists look to help people get rid of fears, we use hypnosis to sideline that critical faculty so we can update our client's version of reality to one they're happier with. But this isn't some magic wand, it's just about creating a framework by which the mind can happily let go of old beliefs and accept new ones. And if we want this new reality to stick, we're still going to have to make sure that our subconscious understands why the old reality just doesn't apply anymore. Now, most of us would say we already know why it doesn't apply, that's why we're trying to change it. But all too often we just scratch the surface when analysing our fears. If we take the time and effort to understand why we currently respond in a certain way and provide a good enough reason to change, we can often render hypnosis or any other subconscious reprogramming technique entirely unnecessary. After all, many of us will have experienced the process of getting rid of an old fear without having to see a specialist to help us. We just in some way managed to get the part of our mind creating the fear to understand that it no longer needed to protect us in this way. It's a bit like how when we're a baby, we need a babysitter to shout at us in alarm if we go to put our hand in the fireplace. Now we're older, we don't need that babysitter because it's not fear that protects us from burning ourselves, it's knowledge and understanding about what's safe and what isn't. Now, it's often said that a logical approach doesn't change our emotional responses, but that's not strictly true. In the moment when our fears are firing, we're not listening to logic. The part of our brain that triggers the fear is operating a one-way street right now and is in output rather than input mode. However, we spend the vast majority of our time not in that mode, and this is when we can actually work through the thinking behind our own responses and promote better ones. I'll often have clients tell me that they don't know why they're afraid of something something, when really they do. They know the reason, but they don't connect with it or address it consciously because that reason doesn't stand up to logical analysis, and thinking about this stuff is something they'd rather not do. Here's an example. When I was younger, I had a huge fear of social interaction. I knew why, and I largely accepted it as just the way I was. I'd been bullied when I was younger, and it had made me very wary of interacting with groups of people. Bad things had happened, and this obviously explained why I was afraid of those situations now. But it was only when I stopped to analyse this fear a little bit more deeply that I got to update my responses. You see, when we're at school, social acceptance is a huge priority. And getting rejected by those people we have to spend every day with can feel like the end of the world. It can feel like life or death. This is why my mind was triggering fight or flight. This response wasn't a malfunction, because fight or flight is the appropriate response to a life or death situation. When I left school and became an adult, it still remained important to me that people like me rather than dislike me, but at some point I realised why it no longer had to seem like life or death to me. You see, once outside of the school environment, my social options were no longer restricted to a specific group of 30 people in my class. As an adult, if I find myself in a situation where people I'm with are rejecting or being negative towards me, I can simply remove myself from that situation and interact with other people. In short, it no longer matters quite so much if the people in front of me right now like me or dislike me. In fact, I know some people will and some people won't, but the consequences are no longer so dire as to be a concern and no longer anything I can't handle. It's remarkable how quickly this tiny piece of processing that just went a little further than I'm scared of social situations helped me remove any fear. Now, there are lots of other good reasons I could have given myself as to why high anxiety and panic were no longer appropriate. I was no longer surrounded by children who tend to be meaner than adults. I was no longer a helpless child myself and now knew a bit more about how to handle potential conflict. Also, my social skills had developed, so maybe I could trust my ability to make a good impression a little more. But the bottom line here is that working out what I still regarded as true that made fear the appropriate response and why it wasn't actually true provided me with the answer that effectively switched off that fear. In my experience of over a decade of working with other people's fears, the moment that creates an opportunity to change is when we understand why our mind is still creating this fear response and providing it with an answer that invalidates that reason. My mind knew not being liked was unpleasant, but it hadn't realised that it was no longer life or death. Connecting with that simple truth allowed that part of my mind to stand down. You see, if all we're going to do to try and change our responses is realise we have a fear and say, it doesn't make sense, I shouldn't be afraid, then that's not actually reasoning it through. It's just accepting our mind is doing something we don't agree with and chastising that part for it. Put a little thought into what your mind still thinks is true that would make this fear appropriate and work out what it needs to know instead. The reason us hypnotists talk about phobias being fairly simple to sort out is because a lot of the time they're only still there because we've not really examined their purpose at this time. As soon as we do, our mind is usually more than happy to let go of them. If you're looking to overcome a fear or phobia, then it's worth remembering that avoiding interacting with or thinking about the thing we're afraid of simply validates that fear and creates a behavioural pattern that reinforces it. If we make moves towards changing this and engage with those thoughts, we demonstrate the opposite behavioural response and adopt an attitude that already suggests there's nothing to fear. My advice is have a listen to what your mind is telling you about why you still fear and see what answers to those concerns you can come up with. Once you've done that, you can head over to another video that I'll link in the description below that takes you through a little exercise designed to directly reprogram your subconscious responses and get rid of unwanted fear and anxiety. Guys, I hope this video has been of value. If you have any questions, then put them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer all of them. Please hit that thumbs up button if you like what I do, and why not subscribe to the channel for weekly mind management tips and anxiety advice. But that's it for now. I'm Tim Box, Mind Coach. Always remember to be kind to your mind, and I'll see you next time.